Hi, welcome to Cosmic and Body Horror. In this channel we discuss content related to Lovecraft horror, Cthulhu mythos and body horror. I upload videos on a daily basis, so before we get started, if I could ask you for a thumbs up at some point during this video if you enjoyed the content, please subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks for your support. Chapter 3 Black Woods and Unfathomed Caves 1898 to 1902. Lovecraft dates his first work of prose fiction to 1897, and elsewhere identifies it as the Noble Eavesdropper, about which all we know is that it concerned a boy who overheard some horrible conclave of subterranean beings in a cave. As the work does not survive, it would be idle to point to any literary sources for it, but the influence of the Arabian Nights, the cave of Ali Baba and other stories involving caves, might be conjectured. A still more likely source, perhaps, would be his grandfather Whipple, the only member of his family who appears to have enjoyed the weird. As Lovecraft states in a late letter, "I never heard oral weird tales except from my grandfather, who, observing my tastes in reading, used to devise all sorts of impromptu original yarns about black woods, unfathomed caves, winged horrors, like the night gaunts of my dreams, about which I used to tell him, old witches with sinister cauldrons, and deep, low, moaning sounds." He obviously drew most of his imagery from the early Gothic romances, Radcliffe, Lewis, Maturin, which he seemed to like better than Poe or other later fantasists. Here are some of the components: unfathomed caves, deep, low, moaning sounds, of the imagery of the Noble Eavesdropper. But Lovecraft admits that this is the only tale he wrote prior to his reading of Poe. Poe was, by the turn of the century, slowly gaining a place of eminence in American literature, although he still had to face posthumous attacks by Henry James and others. His championing by Baudelaire, Mallarmé, and other European writers had slowly impelled reconsideration of his work by English and American critics. I do not know which edition of Poe was read by the 8-year-old Lovecraft. It must have been some school edition. It is, in fact, a little difficult to discern any clear-cut Poe influence in the first several of Lovecraft's surviving juvenile stories, The Little Glass Bottle, The Secret Cave, or John Lee's Adventure, The Mystery of the Graveyard, or A Dead Man's Revenge, and The Mysterious Ship. None of these early stories is dated, with the exception of The Mysterious Ship, clearly dated to 1902, but they must have been written during the period 1898 to 1902, perhaps more toward the earlier than the later end of that spectrum. Perhaps the only tale of genuine interest is The Mystery of the Graveyard, which contains not only a subtitle, or A Dead Man's Revenge, but a subtitle, A Detective Story. This is the longest of Lovecraft's juvenile stories, and at the end of the autograph manuscript he has noted, obviously at a much later date, evidently written in late 1898 or early 1899. The fact that it is labeled a detective story should not lead us to think it is influenced by Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue or any of his other detective stories, although no doubt Lovecraft read them. Even the most cursory glance at this wild, histrionic, and rather engaging story should allow us to point to its predominant source, the dime novel. The first dime novel was published in 1860, when the firm later known as Beadle and Adams reprinted, in a 128-page paper-covered volume 6 by 4 inches in dimensions, a novel by and Sophia Winterbotham Stevens. The fact that it was a reprint was critical, for it allowed the firm to claim that there was a dollar book for a dime. Beadle and Adams was the leading publisher of dime novels until it folded in 1898, having been driven out of business by the bold and innovative publishing practices of Street and Smith, which entered the dime novel market in 1889. It should not be assumed that dime novels were merely action thrillers, although many of them were. There were westerns, Deadwood Dick from Beadle and Adams, Diamond Dick from Street and Smith, detective or espionage stories, Nick Carter from Street and Smith, Old King Brady from Frank Tassay, tales of high school and college life, Frank Merriwell from Street and Smith, and even pious tales of moral uprightness, Horatio Alger, Jr. wrote prolifically for Street and Smith in the 1890s. Their principal features were their price, their format, paper covers, 128 pages or less, and in general, their action-packed narrative style. The leading dime novel series were, of course, priced at 10 cents, although there was a wide array of smaller books, called nickel libraries, at 5 cents aimed at younger readers. It is one of the great paradoxes of Lovecraft's entire literary career that he could, on the one hand, absorb the highest aesthetic fruits of Western culture, Greek and Latin literature, Shakespeare, the poetry of Keats and Shelley, and at the same time go slumming in the cheapest dregs of popular fiction. Throughout his life, Lovecraft vigorously defended the literary value of the weird tale, unlike some modern critics who misguidedly vaunt both the good and the bad, the aesthetically polished and the mechanically hackneyed, as representative of popular culture, as if there is any merit to what masses of half-literate people like to read, and he adamantly, and rightly, refused to consider the weird work found in dime novels and pulp magazines as genuine literature, but this did not prevent him from voraciously lapping up these lesser products. Lovecraft knew that he was reading trash, but he read it anyway. Among the dime novel series Lovecraft admits to reading were Pluck and Luck, to say, 1898 f. Brave and Bold, Street and Smith, 1903 f. Frank Reed, to say, 1892-98, 1903 f. Jesse James Stories, Street and Smith, 1901 f. Nick Carter, Street and Smith, 1886 f. And Old King Brady, featured first in the New York Detective Library, to say, 1885-99, then, along with his son Young King Brady, in Secret Service, 1899-1912. Old King Brady may be the most interesting of the lot for our purposes, since the hero of the Mystery of the Graveyard is one King John, described as a famous Western detective. Old King Brady was not a Western character, but he was a detective. Moreover, Beadle had a detective series, Prince John, written by Joseph E. Badger, Jr., in the early 1890s. I do not know whether King John, even in terms of his name, is some sort of fusion of Old King Brady and Prince John, but he is certainly a dime novel detective. And The Mystery of the Graveyard is a miniature dime novel, pure and simple. The action is nothing if not fast-paced. In 12 relatively short chapters, some as little as 50 words in length, we read a lurid story involving kidnapping, a trapdoor in a tomb, and other flamboyant details. King John not only solves the mystery but ends up marrying the kidnapped woman. The mysterious ship is the latest of the surviving juvenilia, and by far the most disappointing. This story, consisting of 9 very brief chapters, some as short as 25 words and none longer than 75 words, is so dry and clipped that it led L. Sprague de Camp to think of it as an outline rather than a story. This seems unlikely given the elaborate publishing procedures Lovecraft has undertaken for this work. In the first place, we here encounter Lovecraft's first surviving typescript, a text of 12 pages enclosed in a little booklet. This could not have been typed on the 1906 Remington that served Lovecraft for the rest of his life, but must have been some similar behemoth belonging to his grandfather or perhaps even his father. Moreover, there is a sort of gauze cloth cover with a drawing of a ship in pen on it, and another drawing of a ship on the back cover. The imprint on the title page is the Royal Press 1902. It is obvious that Lovecraft is aiming for a sort of dramatic terseness in this narrative, but the result is mere confusion as to what exactly happens. Aside from discovering Poe and giving his fledgling fictional career a boost, Lovecraft also found himself in 1898 fascinated with science. This is the third component of what he once described as his tripartite nature: love of the strange and fantastic, love of the ancient and permanent, and love of abstract truth and scientific logic. It is perhaps not unusual that it would be the last to emerge in his young mind, and it is still remarkable that it emerged so early, and was embraced so vigorously. Lovecraft first came upon a section devoted to philosophical and scientific instruments at the back of Webster's dictionary, and very shortly thereafter he had a full-fledged chemistry set, and was deep in experimentation. As with his enthusiasm for the Arabian Nights, his chemical tastes led his family to indulge the boy in whatever tools he needed. The first book he read on the subject was The Young Chemist, 1876, by John Howard Appleton, a professor of chemistry at Brown University and a friend of the family. The immediate result of the discovery of science was a spate of literary work. Lovecraft began the Scientific Gazette on March 4, 1899. This first issue, a single sheet, still survives. It contains an amusing report. There was a great explosion in the Providence laboratory this afternoon. While experimenting, some potassium blew up, causing great damage to everyone. Incredibly, this magazine was initially a daily, but it soon degenerated into a weekly. No subsequent issues survive until the new issue Volume 1, Number 1, May 12, 1902, and I shall postpone discussion of it until the next chapter. Lovecraft also wrote a number of short chemical treatises. There was a 6-volume series with the general title Chemistry, of which 4 volumes survive: Chemistry, 10 cents, Chemistry, Magic, and Electricity, 5 cents, Chemistry 3, 5 cents, and Chemistry 4, 15 cents. These volumes discuss such things as argon, gunpowder, a carbon cell battery, gases, acids, tellurium, lithium, explosives, explosive experiments, and the like. There is also a small work called A Good Anesthetic, 5 cents. Judging by the handwriting, these works probably all date to around 1899. Non-extant works include ironworking, 5 cents, acids, 5 cents, explosives, 5 cents, and static electricity, 10 cents. It appears that Lovecraft's early scientific interests engendered some practical experimentation, if the following account, related to W. Paul Cook by one of Lovecraft's neighbors, dates to this period. It is one of the most delightful and celebrated anecdotes about Lovecraft that has come down to us. Let Cook tell it in his own inimitable way. That section of Providence in which Lovecraft lived was then open fields, rather swampy here and there, with very few houses. One day this neighbor, Mrs. Winslow Church, noticed that someone had started a grass fire that had burned over quite an area and was approaching her property. She went out to investigate and found the little Lovecraft boy. She scolded him for setting such a big fire, and maybe endangering other people's property. He said very positively, "I wasn't setting a big fire. I wanted to make a fire 1 foot by 1 foot." That is the little story in the words in which it came to me. It means little except that it shows a passion for exactitude, in keeping with him as we knew him later, but it is a story of Lovecraft. This anecdote is, as I say, not dated, but the mention of open field suggests that it occurred while Lovecraft was at 454 Angel Street, since the area was already being built up during his early teenage years. Another rather anomalous discovery Lovecraft made at this time was anatomy, or rather, the specific facts of anatomy relating to sex. Here is his account of it. In the matter of the justly celebrated facts of life, I didn't wait for oral information, but exhausted the entire subject in the medical section of the family library, to which I had access, although I wasn't especially loquacious about this side of my reading, when I was 8 years old, through Quain's Anatomy, fully illustrated and diagrammed, Dunglason's Physiology, and C&C. This was because of curiosity and perplexity concerning the strange reticences and embarrassments of adult speech, and the oddly inexplicable allusions and situations in standard literature. The result was the very opposite of what parents generally fear, for instead of giving me an abnormal and precocious interest in sex, as unsatisfied curiosity might have done, it virtually killed my interest in the subject. The whole matter was reduced to prosaic mechanism, a mechanism which I rather despised or at least thought unglamorous because of its purely animal nature and separation from such things as intellect and beauty, and all the drama was taken out of it. This is an intensely interesting statement. First, when Lovecraft says that he did not wait for oral information, he is suggesting, perhaps without even knowing it, that his mother would certainly not have told him the facts of life, at least not at the age of 8, and perhaps not at any age. Even his grandfather might not have done so. It is remarkable to note that Lovecraft was already so keenly aware of the strange reticences and embarrassments of adult speech at this time that he sensed something was not being told him, at least up to the age of 8, and perhaps beyond, he was a solitary child who largely spent time in the company of adults. And as one who was already a prolific reader, and a reader of material rarely given to the very young, he may have become early aware of anomalies in some of his books also. And as for his declaration that his knowledge of the matter killed his interest in sex, this is certainly the impression Lovecraft consistently conveyed to his friends, correspondents, and even his wife. He does not seem to have had any romantic involvements in high school or at any time prior to about 1918, and even this one is a matter of inference. It took 3 years for Sonia Green to convince Lovecraft to marry her. The impetus was clearly on her side. There has been much speculation on Lovecraft's sex life, but I do not believe there are sufficient grounds for much of an opinion beyond the testimony given by Lovecraft himself and his wife. In any event, Lovecraft's initial enthusiasm for chemistry and physiology would lead to further interests in geography, geology, astronomy, anthropology, psychology, and other sciences that he would study over a lifetime. He may have remained a layman in all these branches of knowledge, but his absorption of many of them, especially astronomy, was prodigious for a literary man, and they helped to lay strong foundations for his philosophical thought, and would provide the backbone for some of his most powerful works of fiction. Lovecraft reports that he began learning Latin around 1898. Elsewhere he says that my grandfather had previously, prior to his entering school, taught me a great deal of Latin, which suggests that he had begun the study of Latin prior to his attendance at the Slater Avenue School in the fall of 1898. It was natural for a boy so enthralled with the classical world to learn Latin, although to have begun it so early, and evidently, to have mastered it in a few years, without much formal instruction, was a notable feat even at a time when knowledge of Latin was far commoner than it is now. We will find that the poetry of Virgil, Horace, and Juvenal left a lasting impression upon Lovecraft, and that the Epicurean philosophy embodied in Lucretius was a central influence in his early thought. One remarkable instance of the classical influence on Lovecraft's juvenile writing is the piece entitled Ovid's Metamorphoses. This 116-line work is nothing less than a literal pentameter verse translation of the first 88 lines of Ovid's Metamorphoses. The date of composition of this piece is, unfortunately, in doubt, but by consulting the various catalogues of works found in his other juvenile works, one may infer that it dates to the period 1900 to 02. The first thing to note about this translation is how different it is from Dryden's. He translated the first book of the Metamorphoses in Garth's Ovid. Lovecraft attempts a far more literal, line-for-line translation, adhering as closely to the Latin as he can. Lovecraft has two subdivisions in his essay, with the headings The Creation of the World, LL 5 to 84, and The Creation of Man, LL 85 to 116. There are, admittedly, similar divisions and headings in Dryden, but his first one, The Golden Age, appears just where Lovecraft's poem leaves off. There is one more remarkable thing about Ovid's Metamorphoses, and that is the possibility that it may be a fragment. The autograph manuscript covers 5 sheets, and the text proceeds to the very bottom of the 5th sheet. Could Lovecraft have translated more of Ovid's text, and could this portion have been lost? I think the probability is strong. This item, priced at 25 cents, is currently not much longer than the poem of Ulysses, priced at 5 cents. Perhaps it is not unreasonable to think that Lovecraft might have translated the entire first book of Ovid, 779 lines in Latin. The translation as it stands admittedly ends at a clear break in the Latin text, as at line 89 Ovid is about to begin the account of the 4 ages of man, but I still believe there was once more to this work than we have. The year 1898 was certainly an eventful one for Lovecraft. He discovered Poe and science, and began learning Latin. He first began attendance at school, and he had his first nervous breakdown. In a late letter he refers to it as a near breakdown. I have no idea what that means. Another near breakdown occurred in 1900. There certainly does not seem to have been anything physically wrong with the boy, and there is no record of his admission into a hospital. The history and nature of Lovecraft's early nervous condition are very vexed issues, largely because we have only his words on the matter, most of them written many years after the fact. Lovecraft reports that I didn't inherit a very good set of nerves, since near relatives on both sides of my ancestry were prone to headaches, nerve exhaustion, and breakdowns. He goes on to cite the case of his grandfather, who had frightful blind headaches, his mother, who could run him a close second, and his father. Then he adds, my own headaches and nervous irritability and exhaustion tendency began as early as my existence itself. I, too, was an early bottle baby with unexplained miseries and meager nutriment assimilative capacities. Early weaning was common practice at the turn of the century and for a long time thereafter, but Lovecraft's remark suggests that his weaning occurred even earlier than was the custom. One remarkable admission Lovecraft made late in life was as follows: my own nervous state in childhood once produced a tendency inclining toward chorea, although not quite attaining that level. My face was full of unconscious and involuntary motions now and then, and the more I was urged to stop them, the more frequent they became. Lovecraft does not exactly date these chorea-like attacks, but context suggests that they occurred before the age of 10. All this led J. Vernon Shea to suspect that Lovecraft might actually have had chorea minor, a nervous ailment that manifests itself in uncontrollable facial tics and grimaces but gradually dissipates by puberty. Certainty on the matter is, of course, impossible, but I think the probability of this conjecture is strong. And although Lovecraft maintains in the above letter that in time the tendency died down, and that his entrance into high school caused me to reform, I shall have occasion to refer to possible recurrences of these chorea-like symptoms at various periods in Lovecraft's life, even into maturity. If, then, it is true that Lovecraft suffered some sort of near breakdown in 1898, it seems very likely that the death of his father on July 19, 1898 had much to do with it. The effect on his mother can only be imagined. It may be best, then, to summarize the relations between Lovecraft and his mother up to this time, as best we can piece them together. There is no question but that his mother both spoiled Lovecraft and was overprotective of him. This latter trait appears to have developed even before Winfield's hospitalization in 1893. Winfield Townley Scott tells the following story. On their summer vacations at Dudley, Massachusetts, Mrs. Lovecraft refused to eat her dinner in the dining room, not to leave her sleeping son alone for an hour one floor above. When a diminutive teacher friend, Miss Ella Sweeney, took the rather rangy youngster to walk, holding his hand, she was enjoined by Howard's mother to stoop a little lest she pull the boy's arm from its socket. When Howard pedaled his tricycle along Angel Street, his mother trooped beside him, a guarding hand upon his shoulder. Lovecraft admits that my array of toys, books, and other youthful pleasures was virtually unlimited. 17 at this time. Whatever he wanted, he seems to have got. At this point it may be well to mention a remarkable bit of testimony provided by Lovecraft's wife. In her 1948 memoir Sonia H. Davis states the following: it was, at that time, the fashion for mothers to start hope chests for their daughters even before they were born, so that when Mrs. Winfield Scott Lovecraft was expecting her first child, she had hoped it would be a girl, nor was this curtailed at the birth of her boy. So this hope chest was gradually growing, some day to be given to Howard's wife, 34. As a baby Howard looked like a beautiful little girl. He had, at the tender age of 3 years, a head of flaxen curls of which any girl would have been proud. These he wore until he was about 6. When at last he protested and wanted them cut off, his mother had taken him to the barber's and cried bitterly as the cruel shears separated them from his head. I suppose one must accept this statement for the most part, although I think rather too much has been made of it, and also of the apparent fact that Susie dressed her son in frocks at an early age. The celebrated 1892 photograph of Lovecraft and his parents shows him with the curls and the frock, as does another picture probably taken around the same time. Lovecraft remarks on the curls himself, saying that it was this golden mane that partly led Louise Imogen Guinea to name him Little Sunshine. But another photograph of Lovecraft, probably taken at the age of 7 or 8, shows him as a perfectly normal boy with short hair and boy's attire. In fact, it cannot be ascertained when Susie ceased to dress Lovecraft in frocks. But even if she had persisted up to the age of 4, it would not have been especially unusual. There are two other pieces of evidence one can adduce here, although their purport is not entirely clear. R. H. Barlow, in his jottings about Lovecraft, mostly taken down in 1934 but some made evidently later, writes, Mrs. Gamwell's stories of how H.P.L. for a while insisted on a little girl. Annie Gamwell could not have made this observation later than early 1897, as that was when she married and moved out of 454 Angel Street, and the context of Barlow's remark, he adds the detail of how Lovecraft would spout Tennyson from the tabletop, could date the event to as early as 1893. Then there is a letter from Whipple Phillips to Lovecraft, dated June 19, 1894. I will tell you more about what I have seen when I get home if you are a good boy and wear trousers. Whipple has underscored the last two words. The implication is, I suppose, that Lovecraft at this time was not fond of wearing trousers. In spite of the above, I see little evidence of gender confusion in Lovecraft's later life. If anything, he displayed quick and unwavering prejudice against sissies and homosexuals. Susie may have wanted a girl, and may have attempted to preserve the illusion for a few years. But Lovecraft even in youth was headstrong and made it evident that he was a boy with a boy's normal interests. It was, after all, he who wanted his flowing curls cut off at the age of 6. In addition to being overly solicitous of her son, Susie also attempted to mold him in ways which he found either irritating or repugnant. Around 1898 she tried to enroll him in a children's dancing class. Lovecraft abhorred the thought and, fresh from an initial study of Latin, responded with a line from Cicero, Nemo fer saltat sobrius, nisi forte insanit. Scarcely any sober person dances, unless by chance he is insane. Lovecraft had developed a certain skill in getting his own way, for, like his initial Sunday school attendance, probably the previous year, which he was allowed to forego, he evidently escaped the dancing lessons. But what he did not escape were violin lessons, which lasted a full 2 years, between the ages of 7 and 9. These lessons were, however, initially at his own insistence. My rhythmic tendencies led me into a love of melody, and I was forever whistling and humming in defiance of convention and good breeding. I was so exact in time and tune, and showed such a semi-professional precision and flourish in my crude attempts, that my plea for a violin was granted when I was 7 years of age, and I was placed under the instruction of the best violin teacher for children in the city, Mrs. Wilhelm Nock. For 2 years I made such progress that Mrs. Nock was enthusiastic, and declared that I should adopt music as a career. But, all this time the tedium of practicing had been wearing shockingly on my always sensitive nervous system. My career extended until 1899, its summit being a public recital at which I played a solo from Mozart before an audience of considerable size. Soon after that, my ambition and taste alike collapsed like a house of cards. I began to detest classical music, because it had meant so much painful labor to me, and I positively loathed the violin. Our physician, knowing my temperament, advised an immediate discontinuance of music lessons, which speedily ensued. One would like to date Lovecraft's second near breakdown to the termination of these lessons, but he clearly asserts that the first occurred in 1898 and the second in 1900. In any event, Lovecraft manifestly continued to be under considerable nervous strain, a situation in part relieved and in part augmented by his first attempt at school attendance, from which he was withdrawn after a year's term, 1898 to 99. Indeed, his casual remark in 1929 that I spent the summer of 1899 with my mother 26 in Westminster, Massachusetts, must lead one to speculate on the purpose of such a trip, and to wonder whether health reasons were a factor. I am inclined to connect the trip with the trauma of his first year of school and also of his violin lessons, which probably ended in the summer of 1899. From all that has gone before, it will be evident that Lovecraft led a comparatively solitary young childhood, with only his adult family members as his companions. Many of his childhood activities, reading, writing, scientific work, practicing music, even attending the theater, are primarily or exclusively solitary, and we do not hear much about any boyhood friends until his entrance into grade school. All his letters discussing his childhood stress his relative isolation and loneliness. You will notice that I have made no reference to childish friends and playmates. I had none. The children I knew disliked me, and I disliked them. I was used to adult company and conversation, and despite the fact that I felt shamefully dull beside my elders, I had nothing in common with the infant train. Their romping and shouting puzzled me. I hated mere play and dancing about. In my relaxations I always desired plot. One confirmation of this comes from the recollections of Lovecraft's second cousin Ethel M. Phillips, 1888 to 1987, later Mrs. Ethel Phillips Moorish. Ethel, 2 years older than Lovecraft, was living with her parents Jeremiah W. Phillips, the son of Whipple's brother James Wheaton Phillips, and his wife Abby in various suburbs of Providence during the 1890s, and was sent over to play with young Howard. She confessed in an interview conducted in 1977 that she did not much care for her cousin, finding him eccentric and aloof. She was particularly vexed because Lovecraft did not know how a swing worked. But she does have a delightful image of Lovecraft, at about the age of 4, turning the pages of some monstrously huge book in a very solemn and adult manner. Lovecraft provides one remarkable glimpse of some of the solitary games he played as a young boy. My favorite toys were very small ones, which would permit of their arrangement in widely extensive scenes. My mode of play was to devote an entire tabletop to a scene, which I would proceed to develop as a broad landscape, helped by occasional trays of earth or clay. I had all sorts of toy villages with small wooden or cardboard houses, and by combining several of them would often construct cities of considerable extent and intricacy. Toy trees, of which I had an infinite number, were used with varying effect to form parts of the landscape. Even forests, or the suggested edges of forests. Certain kinds of blocks made walls and hedges, and I also used blocks in constructing large public buildings. My people were mainly of the lead soldier type and magnitude, frankly too large for the buildings which they presumably tenanted, but as small as I could get. I accepted some as they were, but had my mother modify many in costume with the aid of knife and paintbrush. Much piquancy was added to my scenes by special toy buildings like windmills, castles, and sea. But there was more to it than just a static landscape. With his inveterate feel for plot, and his already developing sense of time, history, and pageantry, Lovecraft would actually act out historical scenarios with his miniature cities. He adds significantly, horror plots were frequent, though, oddly enough, I never attempted to construct fantastic or extraterrestrial scenes. I was too much of an innate realist to care for fantasy in its purest form. Lovecraft does not give an explicit date for the commencement of this fascinating exercise, but I suspect it dates to his 7th or 8th birthday. Although Lovecraft may have been solitary, he was by no means devoted merely to indoor activities. The year 1900 saw the commencement of his career as bicyclist, something he would keep up for more than a decade. Late in life he claimed that he was a veritable bike centaur at this time. Lovecraft's attendance at the Slater Avenue School, formerly located at the northeast corner of Slater Avenue and University Avenue, where St. Dunstan's Prep School now stands, changed all this, at least to some degree. He entered for the first time in 1898, at the highest grade of primary school, presumably the 4th or 5th grade, but apparently withdrew at the end of the term in 1899. Lovecraft does not seem to have returned to Slater Avenue until the 1902-03 school year. During the interim he was, as before, left to satisfy his intellectual curiosity in his own way. His family could hardly have failed to see that the boy was naturally bookish and did not need much incentive to investigate any subject that caught his fancy. Lovecraft states that he discovered W. Frank Russell's The Frozen Pirate, 1887, a lurid and histrionic novel about Antarctica, at the age of 8 or 9, and that it impelled him to write some weird tales based on the same theme. It seems likely that this novel, along, perhaps, with the scarcely less histrionic but more artistically finished narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym by Edgar Allan Poe, helped to inspire Lovecraft's interest in geography, particularly the Antarctic, an interest that led not merely to several works of fiction both early and late but several works of nonfiction as well. Lovecraft on various occasions states that his interest in Antarctica began either in 1900 or in 1902. I am inclined to accept the earlier date, for in an early letter he goes on to say, the Borchgrevink expedition, which had just made a new record in South Polar achievement, greatly stimulated this study. The Norwegian Karsten Egeberg Borchgrevink's great achievement was to have established the first camp on actual Antarctic soil. He had sailed from England in August 1898, established the camp in February 1899, stayed all through the long Antarctic night, May, July 1899, walked on the Ross Ice Shelf on February 19, 1900, and returned to England in the summer of 1900. It is not surprising that Lovecraft's interest would have been aroused by the Borchgrevink expedition, for this was the first important Antarctic voyage since the 1840s. It is also for this reason that 2 of the 3 lost treatises on Antarctic exploration which Lovecraft wrote around this time, Voyages of Captain Ross, R.N., 1902, Wilkes Explorations, 1902, and Antarctic Atlas, 1903, discussed those 1840s expeditions. There were no others in recent memory that he could have written about. In fact, I am wondering whether the dates of writings supplied, in 1936, by Lovecraft are entirely accurate. I would like to date them to an even earlier period, say 1900. The first 2 of these treatises must have treated the nearly simultaneous expeditions of the American Charles Wilkes, 1838-40, who named the continent, and the Englishman James Clark Ross, 1839-41, for whom the Ross Ice Shelf is named. It would seem odd for Lovecraft not to have chosen to write up the expeditions by Borchgrevink and also Robert Scott, 1901-02, so fresh as they would have been in his mind, rather than the expeditions of the 1840s, some of whose discoveries had been superseded by the work of these later explorers. His correspondent C.L. Moore actually saw a copy of Wilkes' explorations in late 1936, although it was not found among his papers after his death a few months later. Antarctic Atlas must have been an interesting work, and presumably consisted largely of a map of the continent, but so little exploration of the land mass had been done by this time that large parts of it were still unknown and unnamed. Lovecraft reports in A Confession of Unfaith that my pompous book called Poemata Minora, written when I was 11, was dedicated to the gods, heroes, and ideals of the ancients, and harped in disillusioned, world-weary tones on the sorrow of the pagan robbed of his antique pantheon. Poemata Minora, Volume 2 is Lovecraft's most finished and aesthetically satisfying juvenile work. The 5 poems bear comparison with any of his later verses, although this is an indication not so much of the merit of these early poems as of the mediocrity of his later ones. The poems in Poemata Minora reveal considerable originality, and few can be traced to any specific works of classical poetry. Lovecraft was endlessly fond of citing the 4th and final stanza of Ode to Selene or Diana as prototypical of his disharmony with the modern age. Take heed, Diana, of my humble plea. Convey me where my happiness may last. Draw me against the tide of time's rough sea and let my spirit rest amid the past. Poemata Minora, Volume 2 is a pleasing little product, fully worth the 25 cents Lovecraft was charging. Volume I is likely to have been equally substantial, as an ad in Volume 2 offers it for 25 cents also. But this was, for the time being, the final product of Lovecraft's classicism. Although he would continue to draw upon the ancients for aesthetic and even philosophical inspiration, a new interest would for a time eclipse all others and impel an overhauling of his entire worldview. For it was in the winter of 1902-03 that Lovecraft discovered astronomy.